On January 13th, 2012, I had the opportunity to speak at Woodlawn School in Mooresville, North Carolina. About a week before I headed to Mooresville, I was talking to Woodlawn's head of school, Angela McKenzie, and she mentioned that the campus is set on a beautiful property that was once a slave-owning plantation. Oh, wow. That stopped me in my tracks. Now, I've studied slavery in the United States extensively, and I'm familiar with its horrors in theory, but I had never actually set foot on a slaveholding plantation. As I prepared for my professional engagement, I knew that I was going to be dealing with a lot of emotions by simply being on the land where slaves were once held. As a way to process and deal with my experience, I asked the folks at Woodlawn if I could take some video. My processing, then, is in this, my first video blog from Change From Within. Located just outside of Davidson, North Carolina, the Woodlawn Plantation was owned by George Stinson and was built by his slaves between 1836 and 1845. One of the only remaining structures from that time on the property is the slave master's house, and though it has been updated and renovated over the years, there are still structures like the 4 fireplaces and original woodworking that were part of the original construction and labor of the slaves. The Stinsons owned between 10 and 25 slaves all the way until the time of the Civil War and Emancipation.
This is plantation owner, the master's house. So it's interesting to note that George Stinson, who is the slave owner and the owner of the property, is known, I guess, for treating his slaves well, whatever that means. And I was just discussing with the head of school here, like, I wonder what that perspective is. Does treating your slaves well mean that you only beat them once a week, or that you beat them less often than the slaves who were held on nearby plantations? And what does that mean? And that there's a lot of descendants in the area. There's a lot of white Stinsons as well as a lot of black Stinsons, and undoubtedly many of those Stinsons have DNA that is common, that is shared between the white Stinsons and the black Stinsons. And that so is that he was a good slave owner, that he only raped his slaves now and then? What is the understanding then? It's a fascinating understanding of perspective and a sad reality that even in the slave owners who treated their slaves quote-unquote well, what does that mean?
Beth Schaffner, social studies teacher at Woodlawn School, showed me around the campus, and she led me on a trek back into the woods where we would find the foundations of the slave houses.
So what we're looking at is the foundation area of what were the slave houses on the plantation.
Actually setting foot in the area where the slaves used to rest was pretty emotionally overwhelming.
It's hard to feel like there is not a responsibility born into my skin for this. And as I spend some time here, it's hard not to feel a little bit overwhelmed by this reality that black slaves laid their heads right here. This was their space. What little space and freedom they had was within the walls of this structure that once was here. It's so easy to feel distanced from this reality for someone like me who grew up in an area of the country where slaves were not held, at least not openly. Being a white person in the 21st century, we distance ourselves. That's what we do. We distance ourselves from this reality so that we don't have to live with its legacy, live with the inequality that now comes from this legacy. But when you are here, it's hard not to feel that power, to know that human beings were owned and lived here.
It left me with a lot of questions, like, what are we supposed to do with this information, with this knowledge of slavery?
And I think that the most important thing that we can do is not distance ourselves from this, to feel this reality, to know that this is here, to not hide it, and as a result, to find a way to be more accountable to the present day implications of this horrible past. Because we cannot pretend that current inequality, the current inequality that exists for African Americans, is not directly linked to this slavery. And we cannot pretend that there are not modern day forms of slavery that are the direct descendants of this institution.
So now, during Black History Month, or any month, what are we doing to help us better understand the ways that slavery still lives with us today? We have to ask ourselves these tough questions if we ever want to see true change.